Hey guys, straight to the point. The Defias Brotherhood could have defeated Stormwind. Now when I say defeat, let me be very specific. I'm not saying they're gonna roll up to Stormwind, occupy the city, and install Vancleef as some bargain bin lord. No. What I am saying is that they have achieved overwhelming success in both Westfall and the heartland of the Kingdom of Stormwind, Elwynn Forest, and I don't think it's that implausible that the Defias could continue that level of success and subsequently extort some sort of reparations or payment out of the kingdom. Now, before we get into what's plausible, what could have conceivably happened, and extrapolate from there, let's just all get on the same page here, okay? Let's talk about what we know for sure about the Defias, specifically as it pertains to their assets, their allies, tactics, things like that. So, assets, let's get into it. In Westfall and Elwynn Forest, think about all of the mines that you come across. Does Stormwind control a single one? No, man, the Defias control every single one, be it directly or indirectly through some of their allies. And if you're not aware that the kobolds are working with the Defias, well, we'll get to that in a second. But anyway, the resources from these mines get shipped down to Westfall into the dead mines, where they create all sorts of, contraptions, and most of it goes towards their super weapon, as they call it, which we know to be the Juggernaut class ship that is, by the way, nearing completion. So moving on to farms, again, think about all the farms in these two zones. I'm pretty sure there's like, one or two that they don't control? And they don't even have to directly control them either, much like the situation with the mines and all those resources that are being used to build these contraptions. One of those contraptions is the harvest golems, which are created by the goblins that the Defias have underneath their employ. So anyway, between these two developments, the Defias have all the raw materials they need for their war effort or guerrilla campaign, however you want to define it, and they have all the food that they need to sustain their forces. But it's not really enough just to have access to these resources and supplies. You gotta get them where they can be implemented or utilized. Like hypothetically, let's say the Defias appoint some guy to be in charge of, Elwynn Forest and all the resources there. Let's just call him Morgan. And Morgan's job specifically could be to just collect all those resources and just organize everything. We'll call him Morgan the Collector. And just basically facilitate the transportation of those supplies all the way down south to Westfall. There's actually a river in Elwynn Forest that flows all the way down to Westfall, and so maybe they can set up like a camp there, and then ideally ship all the supplies from that camp down the river to ideally another camp down in Westfall. From there, they would discreetly bring it to the dead mines. Huh? What's that? Oh, you're saying they did do that? Oh, well, fuck, that's huge. Okay. So apparently with the Defias in full control of all the resources they need and the ability to get those resources to where they need them to be, there's really not much standing in their way in terms of building this super weapon, this Juggernaut. Now, when it comes to physical, tangible assets, that about wraps up what their current situation is looking like. So now let's talk about Vancleef's allies. I think he's done a very good job supplementing his forces here, and he's done that with 4 distinct groups. The first of which being the mercenary Bloodsail Buccaneers. Now this is a big asset to him because his entire plan revolves around using this ship to ambush and destroy Stormwind's harbor and then the rest of the city. But he doesn't know how to use a ship. I mean, the fundamental core of the Defias Brotherhood is stonemasons and rogues and spies, which is another dynamic that the Bloodsail Buccaneers add to his army because most of them are, like I said, they're rogues. They're not really straight up brawlers or fighters. And so Mr. Smite and Captain Greenskin also add that dynamic. And while we're talking about Vancleef diversifying the skill set and abilities of his group, we also got to talk about the goblins, led by Sneed and Gilned. They are the smelters, the craftsmen. They're pivotal to making this ship. Like I said, they also made the harvest golems. Now, Vancleef understands that he can't just supplement his forces with skilled labor, while it's important, but he needs raw numbers to further destabilize the kingdom, and so to this end, he recruits the Riverpaw Gnolls and the kobolds. Now, when we're talking about the Riverpaw Gnolls, led by Hagar, do most people realize that they're working for the Defias? This is confirmed in multiple instances, the first being the gold pickup schedule, which is a random drop-off of one of the Gnolls, and ultimately leads to a quest chain where you find out that Morgan the Collector is paying them off. And also a former insider in the Defias, Wiley the Black, who's located in Redridge, also confirms this as well as the fact that the kobolds are mining for the Defias. I mean, you didn't think the kobolds were in those mines for no reason, right? I mean, nobody mines recreationally. Anyway, the last ally of note that the Defias have actually comes from Stormwind's House of Nobles, and that would be a Mr. Lord Gregor Leskovar. Now, we don't know why Leskovar has decided to help the Defias. You could assume money, perhaps, just like many others, but he's also a nobleman, so that doesn't really seem like a pressing issue for him. Regardless, he proved to be a pivotal piece when it came to the kidnapping of the King of Stormwind, Varian Wrynn, and this impressive feat proves 2 things to me. Number one, that Lescovar is obviously a real asset when it comes to insider information, but number two, that the Defias can do much more than just raid a couple of farms and take over some camps and settlements. I mean, this is an extremely impressive thing that they pulled off. And by the way, shout out to Katrina Presser / Anixia. She's not an official ally of the Defias, but her administrative sabotage of Stormwind's military complex has essentially allowed the Defias to have all this success to begin with. So we've talked about their assets, we've talked about their allies, now let's get into their actual on-the-ground situation. And this really shouldn't surprise anybody. If you remember walking around Westfall, walking around Elwynn Forest, the Defias are fucking everywhere. I mean, it gets to the point where they're like the grass, you don't even see it, you tune it out, but make no mistake, they're around every corner. So here is a visual representation showing all of the Defias camps in both Elwynn Forest and Westfall in red, and then in blue, the camps of the Gnolls or Kobold allies. Because as we know, they're everywhere, but it's hard to really get a true sense of what percentage of Elwynn Forest and Westfall they really control. And again, guys, keep in mind, this is the heartland of the Kingdom of Stormwind. This isn't some, backwood province. Stormwind City is in Elwynn Forest, and what do they have, 30% of the zone in their control? Anyway, we're done with the recap. At this point, we should really kind of be on the same page in terms of the Defias Brotherhood's power and influence, and so now we can go into the point of divergence. Now, as we all know, what ultimately did Vancleef in was a bunch of overpowered, unkillable adventurers that went into the Deadmines at the behest of the People's Militia. And let's just address the elephant in the room. When we're talking about hypotheticals and lore, it's kind of difficult to circumvent the player character. This hero that's supposed to destroy all the content, the big, bad, awesome dude, woohoo! It's really hard to circumvent that, but in this instance, we could kind of hypothesize about a situation where the People's Militia either don't exist or they're allied with the Defias, thereby making the player's interaction in this entire sequence or event negligible. Or, well, non-existent, really. And so let's talk about that situation. The People's Militia, what they really are is a group of farmers and the citizens of Westfall that rallied against the Defias because Stormwind was incapable of protecting their land. And so they're really the only force in Westfall keeping the Defias from having a monopoly on the entire zone outside of, Murlocs. But anyway, the Defias and the people of Westfall actually have more in common than they think, because the people of Westfall have been forgotten about for so long at this point. I mean, the Defias being able to, encroach on everyone's territory and basically take over the entire zone is kind of symbolic of how Stormwind has treated the people of Westfall for quite a while now. And so with all this being said, is it really that implausible that Vancleef, who's a little bit controversial, would be able to diplomatically ally with these people who may feel like the elitist nobility in Stormwind are getting out of control? I don't think it's completely out of the realm of possibility. I mean, shit, guys, didn't something kind of like this just happen in real life? But whatever, maybe you're not subscribing to that scenario, maybe you think it's completely implausible. Scenario number 2. We already know the Riverpaw Gnolls work for Vancleef. What if he decides the best way to ally with the People's Militia is to have them encroach on the territory, and the Stormwind guards, as usual, are nowhere to be found, they can't protect anybody, and so Vancleef comes riding in on his beautiful white stallion and says, "I'll save you!" And in response, the historically disenfranchised citizens of Westfall find the Defias Brotherhood to be better protectors in the Kingdom of Stormwind. Now, scenario number 3. The People's Militia have one base in the entirety of Westfall, and that is Sentinel Hill. And so, straight up, what if the Defias just fucking wipe them out? I mean, on the other side of that very same hill is a large Defias camp, and we already know how influential the Defias are. I find it hard to believe with a genuine concerted effort they couldn't just, destroy them all in one nice afternoon. Now, whatever scenario we ultimately go with, the end goal is to have a monopoly on Westfall and to just buy a little bit more time for the Defias and Deadmines to finish building that Juggernaut-class ship, which again, if you've seen it, is pretty much done. So what I'm saying is, we're really talking about, when you reduce this all down, we're really talking about, could Vancleef buy himself, an extra month of time to finish the ship and launch the attack? The hard part is already done. He's already taken over most of Westfall, he's already taken over most of Elwynn Forest, he's already secured the resources he needs. That's the tough part. The easy part is, hey, can we figure out a way to get a couple more weeks because the ship's almost fucking done, and then we can launch this attack. And speaking of, let's finally get into the attack itself. And keep in mind, guys, Stormwind has no idea that this floating fortress even exists. All things considered, the Defias have done a pretty amazing job keeping their number one asset, their super weapon, under wraps. I mean, even in the traditional lore where we kill Vancleef, you don't find out about the ship until 10 minutes before you kill the man himself? And so what I'm getting at here is there is huge potential for a surprise attack, especially when you consider the fact that the Deadmines is extremely close to Stormwind. I mean, you just sail up the coast of Westfall and you're basically there. And so if the Defias were to sail up the coast of Westfall under the cover of night, combine that with the close proximity, there's really no way that Stormwind would ever see this threat coming until they're already there. You know, it's not like they have a base on the beaches of Westfall. I mean, the beach is full of fucking murlocs, okay? But anyway, let's skip ahead to Vancleef arriving at Stormwind's harbor. It's time for him to make his big decision about how he wants to approach this situation. Is he gonna go diplomatic or scorched earth? Now, let's talk about diplomatic first, because even though I don't think it's the likely option, and it has some prerequisites, the pieces are there for it to be played. So, the Defias Brotherhood, at their core, are stonemasons who were deprived payment after rebuilding Stormwind. The farmers of Westfall historically are disenfranchised, and so if Vancleef decides to ally with them instead of wiping them out, all of a sudden you have a coalition of people that are justifiably upset at Stormwind for past grievances. And guys, the power of a good narrative cannot be undersold, especially if Vancleef decides he can use his small army of rogues and spies to disseminate that narrative like wildfire among the citizenry of Stormwind. And maybe he treats the attack on Stormwind with a little bit more tact. Maybe he doesn't, bombard the city. Maybe he destroys a few ships in the harbor and then blockades it. Now these citizens of Stormwind are not getting their resources, they're not getting their food. They see that their nobility has genuinely wronged these people, and at that point, who knows what can happen. Especially when you have a Nixia who is actively working against the kingdom. So guys, that is the diplomatic route. I don't think it's very likely, it's kind of implausible, but the pieces are there like I said, and if there's any scenario in which Vancleef gets to ride off into the sunset, it's that one. Now for the Scorched Earth, and as far as I'm concerned, this is the canon for the alt history path. And it goes a little something like this. Vancleef takes his Juggernaut ship and sails up into Stormwind's harbor, at which point he destroys the ships that are docked there, thereby securing his position for the bombardment of the city. And this bombardment has three primary goals. Number one being completely devastating Stormwind's infrastructure, thereby rendering all of the hard work done by the stonemasons, who are now the Defias, completely obsolete. Number two, Vancleef has not forgotten about his allies and trusted friends in the stockades, and it is time that they be set free. He sets his artillery on the outlying defenses, keeping all those brave soldiers in there, and elicits a full-scale prison riot. Short of the bombardment, there is no better way to devastate the city. And objective number three, and the most important, level Stormwind's keep and the nobles' garrisons in there to the ground. Now it's hard to say how efficiently the Defias Brotherhood could perform this bombardment, but if there's any organization that could truly cripple the city in this manner, I would think it's the people that built it. The people that know the city like the back of their hand. Anyway, jumping ahead now. Where do the Defias go from here? What's the endgame? And honestly, it's really too hard to say. I mean, at a certain point, you can't really extrapolate in a plausible fashion. I mean, we know that Vancleef's ultimate goal was to take revenge upon Stormwind, and hypothetically, he has done that. And so what's next for him? A hard-earned nap? I don't know. But anyway, guys, that's about a wrap for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you found it to be, if not plausible, at least entertaining to some degree. Consider dropping a like on the video. Let's keep it a buck, guys. Helps me out with the algorithm. You know how it goes. And if you like this type of content, pull up with this subscription, fellas. I'd appreciate it. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll catch y'all soon.